My friends, today I want to talk about faith, but not in a theoretical way. I want to bring a deep reflection, using one of the most emotional scenes from the series The Chosen, which has touched the hearts of thousands of people around the world. This scene depicts something that we all face at some point in life: storms. And the big question I want to ask you today is this: do you have faith to walk on water? Many times the waves of life rise up, the wind blows hard, and it seems like we are about to sink. In those moments, our faith is put to the test. Have you been able to keep your eyes on Jesus, or have you been focusing on the waves around you? Today, I want you to pause for a moment and reflect with me, because just like Peter, you may also be in the middle of a storm right now. Before I continue, I want to ask something very important. If you feel chosen, if you believe that God has something greater for your life, go ahead and leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This is not just a gesture, it is a way of saying, I believe. Now let's together understand what this touching scene has to teach us about faith, courage, and the power of keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus. The scene of Peter walking on water, portrayed in an emotional way in the series The Chosen, is one of the most impactful passages for viewers. This scene not only makes us reflect on our own faith, but also invites us to look at the storms in our lives differently. Just like Peter, we often face moments when the wind blows against us, and it seems that no matter how hard we try, we cannot move forward. It all happens in the dark of night. The disciples are in the boat, rowing against the wind. They are already tired, exhausted from trying. Even together, the feeling of loneliness and isolation is palpable. This reminds us of how many times we have felt this way, surrounded by people but alone in our internal struggles. As they fought against the waves and the wind, one of them notices something different in the distance. A figure is approaching. At first, no one understands what is happening. "It's a ghost," one of them screams. Panic takes over the boat. Fear increases, and chaos seems to settle in. At that moment, a firm and peaceful voice echoes through the wind. "Do not be afraid, it is I." This phrase changes everything. Immediately, terror begins to give way to curiosity and hope. Those who have felt fear take over their hearts know how difficult it is to see things clearly. In the storm, the disciples saw Jesus, but did not recognize him immediately. This happens to us as well. Many times, God is approaching to help us, but fear prevents us from seeing clearly. Our spiritual eyes become clouded by worries, and we end up confusing God's presence with a ghost of our fears. But Jesus not only presents himself, he speaks with authority. "It is I." It is a short phrase but full of meaning. It is not just anyone, it is him. When Jesus reveals himself, it does not matter the strength of the storm or the noise of the wind. His voice is unmistakable. When he manifests, even chaos seems to pause to listen. One character stands out: Peter. He who has always been impulsive, full of courage and doubts at the same time, takes a surprising action. With his heart full of faith and a deep desire to draw closer to Jesus, he says, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." Notice Peter's boldness. He does not ask Jesus to come to the boat or for the storm to cease. He asks to go to Jesus. This is faith in action. Often we ask God to come to us, but Peter teaches that, with faith, we can be the ones to walk toward him. And Jesus responds with a word that transforms the impossible into reality. Come. There are no speeches, no long explanations, just an invitation. When Jesus says, "Come," what was once unimaginable becomes possible. How many times does Jesus invite us to take that step of faith? But we hesitate. We overthink. We fear the wind and the waves. Peter, however, did not hesitate. He puts his foot out of the boat. Imagine what went through the minds of the other disciples. Perhaps they were thinking, "Peter is crazy. He's going to sink." But Peter does not hear the voices from the boat. He focuses on the voice that came from the midst of the storm. The first touch of his foot on the water is a moment of tension. He feels the cold and the resistance of the waves. But miraculously, his feet do not sink. He takes one step, and another, and another. Peter is walking on water, something that no one had ever done. The impossible is happening, and he is living the miracle. What a wonderful scene. What an extraordinary moment. But just as happens with many of us when things are going well, fear begins to whisper. Suddenly, Peter notices the strong wind around him. He realizes how tumultuous the sea is. The noise of the wind seems to grow louder, and the waves seem bigger. At that instant, he takes his eyes off Jesus and begins to look at the storm. And as soon as he looks at the problem, the inevitable happens. Peter begins to sink. Here is one of the greatest lessons from this passage. When we take our eyes off Jesus and focus on the problem, we sink. What once seemed possible, what he was already able to do, now turns into despair. Peter begins to flail in the water and, overwhelmed by panic, cries out, "Lord, save me." And as he always does, Jesus reaches out his hand. He does not let him sink. He does not allow Peter to be lost. Even though Peter doubted, even though he let fear take over, Jesus does not abandon him. He firmly holds Peter's hand and lifts him up. At that moment, he asks a question that echoes in our hearts to this day. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" How many times could Jesus say the same thing to us? How many times do we start well, with faith, taking firm and confident steps? But along the way, we look at the waves, the problems, the noise around us, and begin to doubt. When we doubt, we sink. But even then, Jesus is there, ready to reach out to us. After holding Peter and putting him back in the boat, something even more impressive happens. The wind and the storm immediately calm down. It is not the effort of the disciples that stops the wind. It is not Peter's strength. It is not the boat. It is the presence of Jesus that brings peace to that place. When Jesus enters the boat, peace enters with him. Do you have faith to walk on water? This is a question that resonates deeply in our hearts, especially when we face the storms of life. Today, I want to invite you to reflect on faith, not in a theoretical way, but through one of the most emotional scenes from the series The Chosen, which depicts the story of Peter walking on water. This narrative is not just an ancient story. It is a living lesson on how we can face our challenges with courage and confidence in Jesus. Imagine the scene. The disciples are in a boat, struggling against a fierce storm. The wind blows hard, the waves rise, and they are exhausted, rowing nonstop. This image is much more than a simple narrative. It represents the storms that we all face in our lives. How many times have we felt this way? Surrounded by people, yet still alone in our internal struggles. Sometimes, life presents us with challenges that seem insurmountable. It could be a financial crisis, a broken relationship, an illness, or even a crisis of faith. These moments can leave us tired and discouraged, just like the disciples in the boat. It is important to recognize that storms are part of life. They come to all of us, and often they catch us by surprise. But what can we learn from this? The first lesson is that, even in the midst of the storm, we are not alone. Jesus is always present, even if we do not recognize him immediately. When we look at Peter's story, we see that he and the other disciples were struggling against the waves and the wind, feeling isolated and exhausted. This feeling of loneliness is something many of us know well. In times of difficulty, we may feel surrounded by people, yet still fighting alone with our fears and insecurities. As the disciples struggle against the storm, something extraordinary happens. They see a figure approaching the boat, and fear takes hold of them. "It's a ghost!" one of the disciples screams. Panic spreads, and confusion reigns. But in the midst of the chaos, a firm and peaceful voice echoes, "Do not be afraid. It is I." This phrase changes everything. When Jesus reveals himself, fear begins to give way to curiosity and hope. Many times in our own storms, we may not recognize God's presence. Fear can blind us, making us confuse divine help with something terrifying. How many times, in moments of crisis, have we failed to see God's hand at work in our lives? Fear can cause us to lose clarity and perspective. It is essential that, in the midst of difficulties, we keep our hearts open and attentive to the voice of Jesus. He is always calling us, even when we are surrounded by storms. The question we must ask ourselves is, am I willing to hear Jesus' voice in the midst of my storms? Am I attentive to the ways he reveals himself in my life? Now let's talk about Peter. He has always been one of the most impulsive disciples, full of courage and doubts at the same time. When he sees Jesus approaching, something inside him ignites. With his heart full of faith, he says, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." This is a powerful declaration. Peter does not ask Jesus to come to the boat or for the storm to cease. He asks to go to Jesus. This is faith in action. Many times we ask God to intervene in our lives, but Peter teaches us that with faith, we can be the ones to walk toward him. After holding Peter and putting him back in the boat, something even more impressive happens. The wind and the storm immediately calm down. It is not the effort of the disciples that stops the wind. It is not Peter's strength. It is not the boat. It is the presence of Jesus that brings peace to that place. When Jesus enters the boat, peace enters with him. This is a powerful truth that we can apply in our lives. When we invite Jesus to enter our hearts and our situations, the peace that surpasses all understanding can envelop us, even in the midst of storms. How can the presence of Jesus bring peace amid chaos? Have you ever experienced this peace in your life? It is essential that we seek this peace in our daily lives. When we face challenges, we can remember that Jesus is with us, and his presence can calm our internal storms. As we reflect on Peter's story, we are reminded that faith is not just a concept, it is an action. It is an invitation to step out of the boat and walk toward Jesus, even when the storms of life surround us. Faith calls us to act, to take steps into the unknown, to trust that Jesus is with us at every moment. No matter how big or small those steps may be, the important thing is that you are willing to act. Remember that even when you doubt, Jesus is always there, ready to reach out and rescue you. I thank each of you for being here today, for sharing your experiences, and for opening yourselves to reflection. May we always keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, the source of our faith and peace. Throughout our lives, we will face many storms. Some will be more intense than others. But the truth is that all of them offer us an opportunity for growth. Every challenge we encounter is a chance to strengthen our faith and draw closer to God. When we look at Peter's story, we see that he not only walked on water, but also learned to trust Jesus in a deeper way. This is the journey that we are all invited to take. Faith is a path that requires courage. It is easy to believe when everything is going well, but true faith reveals itself in moments of difficulty. When the waves of life rise and the wind blows hard, it is at that moment that we are challenged to keep our eyes on Jesus. He is our anchor, our rock, and when we stand firm in him, we find the strength to continue. Therefore, as we face the storms of life, let us remember that we are not alone. Jesus is always with us, ready to help and guide us. He invites us to take steps of faith, to get out of the boat and to walk toward Him. And even if, at some point, we may doubt or feel insecure, we can be assured that His hand will always be extended, ready to rescue us. May we then live with this confidence. May we look at the storms not as obstacles, but as opportunities for growth and learning. May we always remember that, regardless of the circumstances, Jesus is with us, and His presence brings peace amid chaos. As we walk together on this journey of faith, may we encourage one another to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, the source of our hope and strength. In every step we take, may we remember Peter's courage and Jesus' faithfulness. May we be inspired to act in faith, to face our fears, and to trust that, even in the most intense storms, Jesus is by our side, ready to guide and rescue us. May the peace of Christ, which surpasses all understanding, guard our hearts and minds as we walk together in faith. Faith is a central theme in the lives of many who seek a deeper relationship with God. Throughout the Bible, we find inspiring stories of people who, amid challenges and uncertainties, demonstrated unwavering trust in God. These narratives not only encourage us but also teach us valuable lessons about how to live with faith in our own lives. Now, let's explore other examples of faith that show us how trust in God can transform situations and guide us in times of difficulty. One of the most powerful examples of faith is that of Abraham. He was called by God to leave his homeland and go to an unknown place. Without knowing exactly where he was going, Abraham obeyed. This obedience was not just a matter of leaving his home. It was an act of faith that involved leaving behind his family, friends, and everything he knew. Abraham's faith was tested even more intensely when God asked him to sacrifice his son Isaac, whom he loved deeply. Imagine the pain and confusion Abraham felt upon receiving this command. However, he did not hesitate. He prepared to obey, trusting that God had a greater plan. At the last moment, God intervened and provided a ram as a sacrifice, proving that He always cares for His children. The story of Abraham teaches us that true faith often requires action and obedience, even when we do not fully understand what God is doing. Another notable example of faith is that of Moses. From his birth, Moses was chosen by God to free the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. When God called him through the burning bush, Moses hesitated, feeling inadequate and insecure. However, God encouraged him, promising that He would be with him. Moses had to confront Pharaoh, one of the most powerful men of the time, and ask him to let the Israelites go. This was not an easy task, and Moses had to demonstrate extraordinary faith to confront Pharaoh and lead his people toward freedom. He also had to trust God during the plagues that struck Egypt and in crossing the Red Sea. Moses' faith not only resulted in the liberation of the people of Israel, but also in the formation of a new nation. He became a leader and a prophet, guiding the Israelites in the desert and receiving God's law on Mount Sinai. The story of Moses teaches us that faith can lead us to great achievements, and that even when we feel inadequate, God can use our lives to fulfill His purposes. Now, returning to Peter's scene of faith, after Jesus saves Peter and they both return to the boat, something extraordinary happens. The wind ceases. This is a clear demonstration of Jesus' power over the storms of life. Here is another powerful lesson. Often, the storm will only pass after Jesus gets into the boat with you. There are people who want the miracle first, who want the wind to stop before Jesus is with them. But the secret is to bring Jesus close. When Jesus enters the boat, there is no more panic, screams, or fear. The disciples, once terrified, now contemplate what has happened with reverence and admiration. They recognize the divinity of Jesus and say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the final response that God expects from us. That, after every storm, we may recognize, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Dear chosen ones, I know that many of you are facing strong winds. I know that the waves seem to want to sink your boat. But remember, Jesus is not distant. He is by your side waiting for you to call on him. Many times, he will call you to do something that seems impossible, like walking on water. Other times, he will allow you to sink a little to learn to trust. But in every moment, he will be there to hold you. Today, I want you to make a decision. Stop looking at the wind and look to Jesus. No matter what is happening around you, keep your focus on Jesus. If you understood today's message and believe that God is speaking to you, write here in the comments, "I will not take my eyes off Jesus." And before you leave, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Do this as a symbol of faith, as if to say, "Lord, I believe and I am ready to walk on water." May God bless your life, strengthen your faith, and help you walk above every storm. You are chosen, and God has great plans for you. Do not take your eyes off Jesus.